In St Louis in 1904, the first man home in the marathon, Lortz, had actually hiked a lift for some of the way. He'd felt tired, pulled out of the race, got a lift, but when the car broke down, he then ran the last couple of miles back into the stadium and was ready to claim the victor's title.
And they also included in the athletics program circus performers who were natives, as they called them, of various kinds, to try and add that sort of exotic, almost sideshow appeal. And so the whole thing lost its Olympic purity.
These first 3 games were enormously expensive, poorly attended, and organisational disasters. And now, just 2 years before the next games, Italy had suddenly withdrawn as host. The hope that the Olympics would become an enduring and regular event slowly began to fade. But then one man seized the initiative. He was Lord Desborough of Taplow, British member of the International Olympics Committee. He'd also participated in the 1906 Athens Olympic fencing event.
He was at Oxford University. He was an expert fencer. He fenced at international level. He was captain of the athletics team here. He was president of the rowing team. He stroked an 8 across the channel. He swam the Niagara Falls twice. He climbed up the Matterhorn several times. He was a great champion at just about everything he did. He was undoubtedly the biggest figure in British sport for a century.
It was Desborough who convinced King Edward VII to host the 4th Olympiad in London. And who better to manage the Games but Lord Desborough himself? He became the talking point of polite society in the drawing rooms of Britain. As Vanity Fair claimed in 1908,
Lord Desborough is more than an athlete and a fencer. He has a really fine and broad mind. He will make an ideal president of the Games, for he has that perfect courtesy which springs from a broad and sympathetic humanity.
Like de Coubertin, Desborough looked to the Greeks for inspiration.
The dominant idea of the old Hellenic games was peace. This same idea of peace and unity, in connection with international athleticism, is capable of a modern application. By holding the games in London, we showed the world how to run things.
Lord Desborough would transform the Olympic Games. For the first time ever, athletes would compete under their national flags rather than as individuals. These athletes would undergo selection in trials. They would wear uniforms and would follow prescribed rules. For de Coubertin and Desborough, London 1908 was to be an international showpiece. It was a vision of a future where peace was brought about through sport. But few imagined the clash of nations off the sports field which lay so soon ahead. Britain's rapid industrialisation and the expansion of its empire meant that by the 20th century it had become the most powerful nation in the world, controlling a quarter of its landmass and a quarter of its population. But with the new century, Britain's supremacy was being challenged. German military progress, Irish independence, and the commercialism of the United States meant that Britain's moment was passing. The United States had become a leader in industrial production and an economic power to be reckoned with. But it was the new social structure in America which was to have the most profound impact on the 1908 Olympics. Britain was a country ruled by the elite. Top-quality sport was largely the preserve of the public school amateur. It was practiced with seemingly little effort and no training.
Amateurs in this period were very much public school and Oxbridge predominantly educated men. Essentially, they were people who could afford to take the time to play without needing funding for it. Lord Desborough is a great example, who didn't need to earn money. Money's coming from other sources, so he had time to devote to sport.
The idea was to not try too hard and to win. Don't be seen to be training, and if you win, be very modest, and if you lose, lose well.
For Desborough, amateurism was the only way in which sport should be practiced.
It is only by keeping amateur status boldly emblazoned on our banner that we can go forward.
But the American James E. Sullivan challenged this concept of sport. From a hobby for the elite, sport in America became commercialized and practiced by America's vast immigrant population, which included Britain's age-old rivals, the Irish.
Some of the class restrictions and some of the ethnic and national restrictions that one would find in Greater Britain or the rest of Europe, one would not find in the United States.
Popularization and commercialization meant competition. Theodore Roosevelt, a keen sportsman himself, declared,
"In life, as in a football game, the principle to follow is to hit the line hard. Don't foul and don't shirk, but hit the line hard."
To stage the Games, Desborough was aware that having the right infrastructure was crucial to the success of London's Olympics. He wanted one key site for field and track events, and for that he needed a stadium. It would be the first purpose-built sports arena of modern times, and was of unprecedented scale. But faced with a government unable to pay for the staging of the Games, Desborough had to come up with another source of revenue. That year, France and Britain were to stage an important trade fair in London. It would be held to celebrate the Entente Cordiale, which had been signed between the two nations. The exhibition would encompass an area of 140 acres and included an artificial lake, several colonial villages, and an immense network of white buildings. In time, the area would come to be known as White City. Desborough saw an opportunity and made his move.
I persuaded the exhibition authorities to pay for a new stadium. They offered £44,000 with a grant of £2,000. In return, they would receive 75% of the ticket receipts.
With pre-echoes of modern construction, the estimate was optimistic.
It ended up costing much more, £220,000. Lord Northcliffe from the Daily Mail agreed to sponsor our final appeal. We were helped by individual donations from Daily Mail readers.
But unlike St. Louis and Paris, these games would not be part of the exposition. They would be games in their own right, performed in a purpose-built stadium and run by the British Olympic Council. Lord Desborough involved himself in every aspect of the development to ensure the White City Stadium was built within 10 months. Given the technology of the day, it was a remarkable achievement. Although it no longer exists, archive footage gives us an idea of what the stadium would have looked like in its heyday.
London's White City Stadium for the widely heralded Mile in the Million. 4 men ran it in less than 4 minutes. Michael Blagrove set an early pace but faded on the 3rd lap. The race itself...
It was eventually demolished in 1985 to make way for the building of the BBC. Today, a plaque commemorating the Games marks the site. The stadium comprised a swimming pool, a cycle track, a running track 24 feet wide, facilities for vaulting, jumping and throwing, and boxes for royalty, the press room and the International Olympics Committee.
Lady Desborough and myself laid the first foundation in 1907.
Olympic villages had yet to be invented, so finding lodgings and transport for the thousands of international athletes, delegates and spectators was no easy task. To solve the problem, Desborough provided hundreds of booklets to the participating nations, recommending bed and breakfast accommodation. Brighton would provide a suitably separate base for the Americans. From here, athletes could exercise daily and take the train to London for competitions. Desborough launched a new era of internationalism when, for the first time, he published rules in different languages. Crucially, these rules defined the amateur status.
Distinctions between amateurs and professionals lingered longer in some sports than others. Athletics wiped out the distinction in the 1980s. By then, obviously, the Olympics had become completely professionalised through Soviet military people, so technically they're soldiers, but essentially they're full-time athletes. The Americans responded with a very strong college scholarship system, so technically they're students, effectively they're athletes professionally, and nobody else could carry on and compete with that.
The amateur-professional dilemma remained an enormous problem in the Olympic movement for the rest of the 20th century until at the end of the century the IOC finally simply got rid of the amateur distinction, and there is no more rule about amateurism in the Olympic movement, but it remained a very sticky wicket, particularly from the British point of view.